Welcome to this UCL lunch hour lecture on how can a better economics help address the climate crisis. My name is Professor Nadia Meli, and I'm a multidisciplinary researcher specializing in economic, financial, and policy aspects of climate change and energy-related issues. But before we start with the real lecture, before we begin today, we'd like to briefly recognize that 2026 marks UCL bicentenary. It's an important moment for us as a community, and to open the event, we will share a short film that reflects on this milestone. After that, we will move straight into the lecture.
200 years ago, there was no university in London, and we're really marking the coming of a very radical, very different institution to a city that was the largest city in the world.
UCL was to be open to people of all faiths, or indeed no faith.
Women were admitted to the Slade School of Fine Art when it opened at the start of the 1870s, and from 1878 women were able to come to UCL, study alongside men and get a degree. And this was way before any other university was giving degrees to women.
In UCL's bicentennial year, you can expect a major new exhibition, 3 books, installations from renowned artists, and UCL Illuminated, a spectacular immersive sound and light show on our central London campus.
The main chord is going to turn into a multi-day theatre with filming, workshop, lights, laughter, comedy, theatre and drama. It's going to be magic.
I'm really excited about telling people the story of how we as an institution have evolved over 200 years and how we're going to evolve for the next 200 years.
It is now my honor and pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Pete Barbrook-Johnson. Dr. Pete Barbrook-Johnson is a social scientist, economist, complexity scientist, and system thinker. He's regularly working on energy and environmental policy issues. He's a lecturer in social economics at UCL, a teaching associate at the Environmental Change Institute, and an associate at the Institute for New Economic Thinking, both at the University of Oxford. So before we begin, I want to let you know that we will have some time at the end of the lecture for questions, and this can be submitted at any point during the talk by going to Slido. Do please enter investigate the event code, which is economics. And now I think we're ready to start. I will now hand over to Pete for his talk.
Thank you, Nadia, and thank you to the lunch hour lecture team for organizing today's session. It's a pleasure to be here and share some of my work on different forms of economics and how they apply to the climate crisis and to the energy transition. So I sort of posed this kind of slightly tongue-in-cheek question: how can a better economics help address the climate crisis? And what I want to do today in the next kind of 40 minutes or so is come at it from three angles. First, as any good kind of academic, I need to set out what do I really mean by economics and what's really going on there. I think it's important we have a broad view of economics, that there's lots happening. So I want to think about that. What is economics and what are economists saying about the environment? Then I want to move on to a bit more thinking about what economists are doing now, the work that's actually having an influence now, the ideas, the methods that are influencing the decisions, the climate policy we have. And then I want to get a bit more into this idea that maybe some of those influential approaches have not been as helpful or have not been as ambitious, maybe in terms of the climate policy they underpin. And so introduce that idea and explore that, and then think about what the alternatives might look like. What are better economics? What do I mean by that? Give some concrete examples. And that's really, I think it's important to note that I'm not sort of saying that the rest of economics is rubbish and we should throw it out, but it's much more about thinking about economics as ever evolving and thinking about when different types of economics are fit for purpose and finding the right tools for the job at hand. Okay, so let's dive in. So what is economics? And you can see here on the right a big horrible diagram. I'm a big fan of horrendograms, as I call them. This is definitely a horrendogram, trying to overview all the different schools of thought in economics. And I think a big take-home message for me is that there's lots of different types of economics. There's lots of different flavors. There's plenty of arguments between these different boxes. And so economics is not one thing. It's not one agreed upon kind of orthodoxy, even though it might feel like that sometimes, or there's definitely dominant strands sometimes. Um, but what really is economics about? Like when I was doing my A levels in school, this first definition is the one I was given, that economics is about the allocation of scarce resources. I always found that a pretty opaque kind of term, not that instructive. It didn't give me a feel for what economics was. But at least it gives us the idea that, economics is about understanding scarce resources. Maybe in the past, if you go back 200 years when economics was forming as a field, maybe we didn't think of the environment as particularly scarce. But now we do. We understand that there's very finite resources we're using from the environment, and that maybe polluting, spewing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, putting pollutants into our seas, etc., is not a kind of endless thing we can do. There is a finite scarcity to that resource, as it were, to that sink. So economics maybe can help us think about how we manage those types of scarce resources. Another definition I find a bit more useful, but maybe a little bit limiting, is this idea that economics is the study of human behavior, that it's a social science, it's the study of individuals and markets, which we might call microeconomics, or it might be the study of of nations, dynamics around the globe, which we might call macroeconomics. I think that's helpful in the sense that it helps us think about things as a social science, but maybe is a bit limiting. My favorite or kind of definition is this last one, which is the idea that economics is basically just the study of the economy. And so then the question becomes, well, what's the economy? And for me, the economy is the system by which we metabolize inputs into useful outputs. It's the metabolism of society, the same way our stomachs, our guts is the metabolism of our body. And so the economy we think of it as the system which creates solutions to human problems, that turns these inputs into outputs and solutions. The reason I like that definition is it helps us think about the economy in a more biological, more organic sense. It makes us maybe think about the economy as an ecosystem, or a collection of bacteria in our gut turning inputs into useful things for our body, useful things for society. And that those processes, those biological kind of metaphors, I think are useful because they help us think of the economy less like a machine and more, as an ecosystem where maybe there are non-linear processes, maybe there's emergent processes. Things are not so easy to follow. They're not so predictable as they are with maybe a machine. Um, so what have economists said about the environment or about sustainability? And here is a real kind of, this is probably the most words on one slide I'm going to show today. And this is a real kind of crash course in some of the history of economic thinking on sustainability. And even though there's a lot of words for one slide, the fact I can get it on one slide, I think is quite instructive, because really there's not been a huge amount of work in economics on sustainability, especially I think in the 18th and 19th century. It's really, even though there are examples, really for me, the story is that there's not much focus on this as a topic. It's definitely an understudied topic. You have, in the 18th century, people like Marquis de Condorcet working on this, but really work that was never appreciated at the time, went unpublished. You have people like Thomas Malthus, much more well known for that work, but always something that's kind of taught to students as being incorrect. That the Malthusian theory never came to fruition because we managed to outpace it with developments in agricultural technology. I was always taught that, not in my economics A level, my geography A levels was always told, Malthus was wrong. Moving into the 19th century, some of the big figures, the names pop up. These are some of the founding figures, and they are founding fathers. They're all old white men, as you can see on the right. These are some of the founding figures in economics, and they did start to talk a little bit about sustainability issues. There's a theme here, I think, around the extraction of resources and how extraction of resources might constrain growth. John Stuart Mill, who's not really thought of as an economist, did talk about the role of the state in preserving nature. And then we get through to this really core idea from Alfred Marshall about externalities, this idea that when we have an economic relationship between maybe a buyer and a seller, there might be costs and benefits external to that buyer and seller. So when I go and buy some petrol and then burn it in my car, that causes a cost to everyone else that is not necessarily represented in my relationship with the petrol station. Um, and then moving into the 20th century, I think is when we see much more work being done. It really starts to explode in the amount of work. We have more work on externalities. We have more and more work on resources, both renewable resources and non-renewable resources. And then towards the end of the 20th century, we have huge movements around sustainable development, pushed forward by the UN. We have things like the Sustainable Development Goals then appearing early in the 21st century. And we have the clear kind of identification of fields, around specific fields in economics, so environmental economics, ecological economics. And the same as I said before, there's a lot of different things going on in economics. I think it's true here as well. This distinction between ecological and environmental is often quite meaningful. There's very different views about what we should do coming from those different strands of economics. And you can see that a bit in this diagram. This is a diagram, a fairly simple diagram, knocked together by a guy called Yevgeny Bluestein. This is off Twitter from a few years ago. Unfortunately, I think his account is shut now for probably understandable reasons. What this diagram is trying to do is describe the kind of different fields of economics as they work on climate, and what the things they work on are. And so maybe on the left-hand side is the more traditional or kind of established areas, the ones maybe we think of. It's not always the case, but we might think of as the kind of standard economics, people working on growth, on GDP, on trying to fix market failures. Definitely the way I was taught, that was the kind of the starting position. But that's just one part. There's whole other parts of economics, particularly ecological economics, and then moving out into a wider selection of different types of heterodox economics. Heterodox is this awkward phrase, sort of capturing lots of different kind of non-standard types of economics. And you can see the types of topics they work on. There might be some overlap, environmental and ecological economics might work on emissions trading together, but they also might work on different things. They might work on the just transition or alternatives to growth, the post-growth or degrowth agendas, or planetary boundaries, things like this, all the way through to political ecologists and heterodox economists working on things like coloniality, decolonizing economics, thinking about state and class power. So you see, hopefully you get a feel for the variety of things people are working on. And some of these groups of researchers and practitioners, they argue about these things quite fiercely. They don't agree on how they see the world and what their kind of policy advice or suggestions for action are. So that's a bit of an intro to economics and some of the different work on environment and sustainability. What I'm going to do now is kind of zoom in a bit more directly to two specific areas of work. And these are particular bits of work that I think have been very influential in what we've done so far in terms of climate policy and the energy transition. So the first is integrated assessment models. These are computer models that represent the economy, the energy system, the climate system, land use, these different components of how we might think about climate change, the kind of most relevant domains or systems to the global climate system. So they're not just climate models, they're not just weather models. They also have, very importantly, and sort of perhaps more emphasis on the economy, the energy system, land use. And these models have been extremely influential, but in national governments, particularly in international efforts. You've probably seen the outputs of integrated assessment models in the types of reports or the graphs produced by the IPCC that used to underpin many of our kind of steering global climate targets. So integrated assessment models are there. That's one big strand, and I'll talk a bit more about those in a moment. The other really influential approach is not so much about modeling. Integrated assessment models are their models. They're technical simulation things. They're like these modeling approaches. Cost benefit analysis is more of a framework, just a concept of how should we make decisions. It's not such a technical thing. It's more just a principle of how do we make decisions. And I mean, I hope many of you would have bumped into cost benefit analysis or heard the phrase. Um, it's basically a tool for helping us weighing up the costs and benefits of any intervention we might be thinking of, whether that's some big energy policy or whether that's, building a bridge or investing in some new infrastructure or whatever it might be. So I think cost benefit analysis is another particularly influential idea, and I want to play with and explore how that idea might have helped or not more ambitious climate action. Um, so let's dig a bit deeper into integrated assessment models, IAMs as they're sometimes called. So you see here a diagram that tries to give a feel for what they're doing. They are maybe taking in assumptions about GDP and growth, assumptions about the population of the world, particular policies, maybe like the price of carbon taxes or emissions trading schemes, that type of thing. They have other assumptions about what's going on in the future. Those are then fed into these different models of the subsystems of the economy, of the energy system, etc. Fed into those, and what the model then spits out at us as an output might be the economic outcomes, the growth we might see, the jobs we might see, maybe the emissions, importantly, we might expect, the energy pathways, the energy mix, how much energy we are getting from different technologies, the land use, how much land are we having to use for these different technologies. Um, so that's a kind of 101, what's kind of going on with them. And really hopefully you get a sense they're called integrated because they're combining these different elements, these different parts of the system. I think it's important to say there's lots of different types. There's no one integrated assessment model that is standard. There's groups of them. There was definitely an early cohort of models developed kind of 20, 30, 40 years ago, which are considered fairly out of date now. And there's a newer cohort of models now that are much more complex. And these models are built by large teams of people. This is not it's individual researchers working on this. This is a team science effort. Um, let me try and kind of dig a bit deeper into the logic of how they work without getting lost in the technical details. So for me, the basic idea is we put in these assumptions about GDP, about population, about policies. We put in constraints. We give constraints to the model and say, oh, there's certain assumptions about technologies, how much they cost, where we can put them, how much we can develop of certain technologies like solar or wind. And given those constraints, these models will find the optimal configuration. And that's normally optimal with respect to cost. So it's saying, given these constraints about what's going to happen in the future, what's possible and what we think is going to happen, please tell us the least cost way we can deliver that configuration. So these models are they're called optimization models. Another name they're referred to as they optimize with respect to costs given these constraints. So they're really good at telling us if we've got a goal in mind, what's the cheapest way to get there? And really excellent at doing that. And that's one of their core purposes and very good at that. What that means, though, is that they're less good at identifying what's likely to happen because they're always looking for what's the cheapest combination of energy technologies to deliver some goal, to deliver some climate target or deliver some growth target. What they're not telling us is what we really think is likely to happen given where we are now and what might come next. It's a really important distinction. This optimization framing of what's the least cost or the ideal way to go versus a likelihood way to go. What's the most likely thing to happen? let me move on to cost benefit analysis. Um, so, as I said, this has been a very influential tool. I think it's important to recognize that's mainly in the global north, in North America, in Europe, and particularly the UK. This is a very dominant framing in policy in policy thinking. That's true elsewhere around the world, but much more patchy. I think I've done a little bit of work on this in Brazil. This is a particularly powerful idea. I think in India, sometimes in China, extremely important in terms of climate action. Cost benefit analysis is less popular and less well used, I think. What we're doing with cost benefit analysis is trying to quantify and then compare all of the costs and benefits of some action. And often you'll hear this phrase net present value referred to, and this is the kind of output of once we compare all the costs and all the benefits, what is the net present value? Is that net present value positive, i.e. the benefits outweigh the costs, or is it a negative value, which means the costs outweigh the benefits? And it tends to be that the easy things to quantify and value get thrown in, and the things that are difficult are ignored. And of course, if you read more advanced textbooks on cost benefit analysis and you speak to the academics who develop these ideas and practice, they will have answers of how to deal with that. And that's great, that's needed. But I think we need to also recognize that in practice around the world, governments are using pretty narrow versions of cost benefit analysis. They are not doing the all singing, all dancing ideal way of doing cost benefit analysis. They're doing the way they can get done quickly with scarce resources. And so yeah, we get that net present value, and that helps us do something, helps us decide if we want to do something. And decision makers, this is really important. Decision makers, senior civil servants, politicians, I think really love cost benefit analysis because it turns all of that difficult political thinking around the policy into one number, and one number expressed in the same way in pounds and pence or dollars. And that becomes then comparable across policies. And so we can look at different policies or interventions and directly compare them. And it gives this sense of rigor and responsibility, this appeal to cost effectiveness and saving money is very appealing and plays well in all sorts of political spaces. So decision makers really value that, and there's some really useful functions of cost benefit analysis for decision makers. But I said at the start, I want to question a bit, are these tools causing us trouble, or are they maybe not quite as great for the climate crisis now as they might have been in the past, or as they might have worked in other domains? And I do want to, this is where I start to kind of stick with that idea, and maybe others might disagree. But for me, integrated assessment models, as I said, are great for identifying a target or an optimal path, but they're not going to help us tell us how to get there or what's likely to happen next. And that's a big challenge, and that's where we're at now with climate policy, right? We're not arguing so much about should we do anything. I know in some places around maybe that argument's being coming back around, but I think in lots of places we know we want to do something, and the question is how do we do it? How do we develop specific policies in specific sectors? It's not what's the right, is it 1.5 or 2 degrees, or what's the cheapest technology? The question is how do we make this transition happen? I also think just because of historical quirks, integrated assessment models have made some poor assumptions about the cost of renewables, and this is a huge, really important assumption that goes into the model. How much wind and solar are going to cost, and I'll talk a bit about this in a minute and show you that that's been a big problem, I think. There's also it depends by different models. All the models are not the same, but there are many models where there's missing feedbacks, where the impact of changes in the climate on the economy, and they're called sometimes damage functions, how much the climate changing damages the economy, that's sometimes been missing. And there's also sometimes been this missing feedback between using renewables and then the cost of renewables coming down. So I think there's been some missing feedbacks. And if we think about the energy transition as this dynamic, organic process, as I hinted at the start, those feedbacks, if they're missing, that's a big, big problem. On cost benefit analysis, I think there's some different issues. One, the big difference, I think, or big problem rather, is that cost benefit analysis assumes that the interventions, the policies we're making, that we're assessing, are marginal. That's some great economics jargon, marginal. What we really mean by marginal is these are policies that don't make a big difference. We're maybe assuming we're making a small change to taxes, or we have a small social policy around, young families or something, and that this is a small tweak to the economy. And that if that holds true, then cost benefit analysis can work well. We can be fairly sure of the costs and benefits. But in the climate space, in energy transition type spaces and type policies, we're trying to be much more transformational. We're trying to change whole sectors. We're trying to shift the demand for technologies. We really are, doing systems transformation. And so climate policy breaks through that assumption in cost benefit analysis. And what that tends to mean is that we're much less certain about what's going to happen in the future. And I would argue it's tended to be that cost benefit analysis has underestimated the benefits of climate action, because climate action is so transformative and throws things up into the air so much, and cost benefit analysis just is not always set up to work with that. Okay, so I've started to throw some stones at integrated assessment models and cost benefit analysis. Let me say a bit more about what the alternatives might look like. Because it's easy to make critiques and be rude about other things. What's hard is showing how you do better, or how you do different. So what I want to show you is three different things, two types of models or modeling that is different. One is a type of modeling I will call system archetypes, which really tries to think about these feedbacks, these organic kind of dynamic processes in the economy and the energy transition, and tries to think about those carefully and actually model them qualitatively. It's not just quantitative. This is a qualitative methodology. Then I want to show you some more quantitative modeling and see what it looks like. How do the answers change when we bring in different assumptions about the cost of renewables, when we bring in these feedback loops into our quantitative modeling? And then lastly, I want to show you this kind of alternative to cost benefit analysis, which I and others call risk opportunity analysis. The phrase on its own doesn't tell you much maybe, but it's a kind of more dynamic, broader version of cost benefit analysis. So I want to say a bit about that. Okay, let's keep cracking on. System archetypes. So what we're doing here is trying to qualitatively describe some of the dynamics in the energy transition, in the economy, because we think these are really important in understanding how transitions happen. And it's really helping us think in a more dynamic, and I think also hopefully more transparent way. So what you can see here on the top left is a reinforcing feedback loop. That's why it's got an R in the middle. Reinforcing just means it's kind of self-propelling, self-fulfilling. If we start at the bottom of that four circles, we see a node, a circle called investment and deployment in renewables. And so what this diagram is showing is, as we invest and deploy more renewables, we are going to increase, we argue, I think it's a reasonable assumption, the innovation in renewables. As we get more innovation in renewables, we're then going to see a decrease in the cost of renewables. Again, I think a reasonable assumption, and I can show you some evidence for that in a moment. And then as the cost of renewables comes down, the demand for renewables is going to go up. And then as the demand for renewables goes up, we get more investment again, more deployment. So it becomes a self-propelling reinforcing loop. And that's called one way to name that is the renewables learning by doing feedback, this idea that as we use this technology, we get better at it, it gets cheaper, and that becomes a self-propelling process. And we've seen that around the world, right? That's why we've seen renewables going up exponentially in lots of different places around the world, and the cost of renewables coming down really fast. You think of the cost of solar panels 40 years ago, let alone 10 years ago to now, huge shifts, non-linear changes. And it's that learning by doing feedback that's driving that. So that's a great story. And people like me who work on the energy transition, this is fantastic. We're really lucky that this feedback loop has been active and been happening for renewables. This is great. But we also need to think about where there might be dampening feedbacks that slow us down, that hold us in place. And this is what you can see on the right-hand side. So again, we have some of the same ideas. So here we have VRE, that stands for variable renewable energy. So just again, think of it as renewable. So we see the renewable, if I start on the left, we see the renewable investment, increasing deployment, increasing generation, increasing the penetration of renewables into the energy system. So all so far, so great. But then that can fire a bunch of dampening feedback loops. As we get higher penetration of renewables, we get more fluctuation in prices because renewables are variable. As we get more fluctuation in prices, maybe that increases the cost of capital. Investors are not quite so sure what the returns are going to be, so that reduces profitability. As we see renewables go up, we might also see reductions in the price received by renewables. Renewables have often taken advantage of the fact that in recent years that fossil technologies are more expensive, so they make a bit more profit, and that profit's going to go down. I think prices are going to get lower. You would expect as we get into higher penetration of renewables because these technologies are cheaper, and so that's going to reduce revenues. Also, as we get into higher renewable systems, we're going to have more curtailment. Curtailment is where we have to turn off or not use the energy produced by renewables because either there's too much of it in the system or the prices have gone negative because there's a huge oversupply. So there's a bunch of pathways there around the curtailment and the surplus of renewables, which are again going to push down revenues. And so what these simple, kind of relatively simple diagrams are showing are these potentially very powerful feedback dynamics that are shaping the renewables landscape. And our role then as researchers or maybe as decision makers, as policymakers, becomes to encourage the first one and maybe to manage these dampening feedbacks. And how successful we are in doing that as policymakers will determine whether our transition to renewables looks like the blue line at the bottom left or whether it looks like the orange line. If we can reduce those dampening feedbacks, we're going to see more deployment of renewables. Whereas if those dampening feedbacks are kicking in and we're not managing them, then that's going to slow us down and we're not going to deploy as much of these technologies as we could. So policy making becomes about managing those as much as it was previously about getting that feedback, the reinforcing loop to fire. And I think we are seeing evidence. You see negative pricing now of renewables in the UK. You do see evidence of these dampening feedbacks kicking in now in the countries where there's high renewables in the system. Okay, what about modeling this quantitatively? So I've introduced these feedback loops, particularly this learning by doing reinforcing loop. Now I want to think about what does that look like when we model that quantitatively. And this is the question that some of my colleagues at INET, Rupert Way, Matt Ives, Penny Mealy, and Doan Farmer were interested in. They looked at historical costs of different types of energy. And this is what this plot shows you here. I'm going to show you a few plots now. Bear with me. I'll try and explain the key bits. They are a little bit dense in places, but I think they're really instructive. So here you see, useful energy cost is the cost of energy from different sources through time over quite a long period, going back to 1880. And so what you can see here, and this is, I should mention, this is on a log scale, right? So those numbers as they go up are getting bigger, faster and faster. What we're seeing here is some of the fossil fuel costs, I would argue, are fairly flat. If you look at that brown dotted line for coal, if you look at the black dotted line for oil, the grey dotted line for gas, I would argue broadly over that whole period, they are flat. The cost of those technologies is staying roughly the same. Whereas when we look at some of the other lines, we look at that green line for power to fuel, this is electrolysis. If we look at the line for batteries, if we look at the line for solar, the kind of gold, yellow, mustard color line, if we look at the light blue for wind, these lines, I think I would argue, are showing a different behavior, a kind of qualitatively different behavior. They are coming down at different speeds, but they are coming down over that period. Some of them very fast. The costs are coming down exponentially. And that's where what's driving that is that feedback loop I showed you before that's driving down the costs. They get cheaper, we do more of them, the costs come down, we do more of them. And so we can see historically that these costs are coming down really fast, whereas fossil technologies are flat. The funny one I think in here often is nuclear. Nuclear is the pink one, and that's either flat or maybe going up a bit. And yeah, nuclear is a big, lumpy, technical term for you there, lumpy technology. So it's hard to get better at nuclear power stations, whereas the solar panels, they're small, they're modular. We make many thousands, if not millions of them. So we get really good at making them and they get really cheap. So that's historical data. On this plot from the same team, I think what you can see really powerfully is this point about integrated assessment models and their assumptions. So on the left-hand panel, we see these black dots. The black dots are the cost of solar panels, of photovoltaics. So that's the real data on cost. So again, we see this drop in solar panels, again on a log scale. So this exponential drop in the costs of solar panels. Great news. And then these lines we see we're going across are the lines that the modelers used in the not that distant past, only 5, 10, 6, 7, 8 years ago, to make assumptions about where those costs might go in the future. And what you can see there is those projections, those red and light and blue lines, the costs, they are always pessimistic, right? The real costs keep going down, even though the projections are always more pessimistic. They always assume the costs are going to go down slower. So that's where, when I say integrated assessment models have not made such great projections around cost, that's why I'm saying that, because of that plot, because the real costs have gone down faster than they assumed. And again, that's because the feedback loops in the model, I think, are not represented at all or not represented strong enough. Okay, so if the data is showing us that these feedback loops are there, if the integrated assessment models have not quite done it as strongly as we think, or they've underestimated that drop in cost, what happens if we do put those feedback loops into our quantitative forecasts? And the short answer is the energy transition suddenly looks a lot more appealing and becomes a lot less costly. And so what both of these plots are showing you is the cost, the net present cost of different versions of the energy transition. We have the fast transition in blue, a slow transition to renewables in gold, and a no transition in black. And what you see on the first plot is the net present cost is lower more often in different simulations of the fast transition, and the net present cost is higher in a slow or no transition. I don't want to dwell too much on the details of these plots, but just to say that, yeah, the net present cost, when we put in these assumptions about renewables coming down, it means a fast transition is cheaper. The cost is negative. It's cheaper to do a fast transition. And the scale of that is huge. So the plot on the right gives you a sense of the scale. So if we have discount rates, a discount rate is a way economists measure like how much we care about the future. So a higher discount rate means we discount the future more. We care about the future less. We discount the value of that. So if we have discount rates around 2%, we see the net present cost of a fast transition is maybe 12 trillion, this is trillions of dollars cheaper than no transition, or maybe $5 trillion cheaper than a slow transition. So we're talking about globally humongous amounts of money because of these cheaper renewables. Okay, I'm conscious of time. I've only got about 5 more minutes left. Let me move now on to how do we plug these ideas into the policy process and try and make a pitch to you about risk opportunity analysis as an alternative to cost benefit analysis. So as I said, already cost benefit analysis assumes an intervention does not change the system. It assumes that the variation in people or firms and the variation in outcomes between them is quite low. It assumes we have certainty. When we're talking about energy policy, climate policy, I don't think those things are true. We don't have certainty. There's more variation. So what we have to do is think more about capturing that uncertainty and acknowledging we don't know everything, and we need a slightly more dynamic, broader way of assessing the potential impacts of a policy. And so what we do in a risk opportunity analysis is instead of just adding up costs and benefits, we do a slightly more involved process. And it is more involved. There are more things to do. It is slightly more complicated, but because I think the problem is more complicated. The first thing we do is map the system. So we try and identify the boundaries of the system. We identify the feedbacks. I've shown you a few feedbacks. So whatever policy system we work in, we go, what are the feedbacks that are operating here? Is there learning by doing? Are there dampening feedbacks? Are there other types of feedbacks that might be very powerful in affecting the outcomes in this system and affecting how our policy works? And then we need to make sure that those feedbacks are represented in our modeling, in our more quantitative modeling. We then do the modelings, and I've shown you one example of that just previously. But we then do that modeling, and instead of giving one kind of net present value, what we need to do is really explore a range of outcomes. And I really almost don't care too much which model we use, as long as the model has these feedbacks in it, and the model has some kind of randomness in it that sort of isn't too deterministic. I think we can then get a spread, a sense of where outcomes might be. We get a distribution of outcomes rather than just saying, here's the one net present value. So we need to think about a distribution of outcomes. Then we need to do some risk assessment. We need to think through what are the worst case situations that might happen when, the feedback loop we were hoping is going to fire doesn't. The feedback loop that we're worried about, the dampening one, that does fire. What's that kind of worst case extreme outcome where everything falls apart and it all goes wrong? But then equally, what's the best case scenario when the feedback loop fires great, when we manage all the dampening feedbacks and we see these exponential rises in technologies and falls in costs? What does that look like? And so we get this kind of worst case, best case, and try and assess those. And only then do we take that kind of suite of information about feedback loops, about a sense of distribution of outcomes, and a sense of worst case and best case, and then bring those things to decision makers rather than one net present value. So that's the kind of a crash course in what risk opportunity analysis looks like. It's definitely technically more demanding. I'm not particularly tied to one model or another, but we need these models to have the feedbacks in them. And what it doesn't do is give us that simple one figure to compare things. So it's more difficult for policymakers to use and to communicate to them. But I think it's important because it moves us to a place where we have more realistic representation of what might happen rather than a kind of false precision. Okay. I also in the blurb for the talk made this argument that maybe we need a more participatory economics. And I just wanted to flag how I see that happening, because it's not maybe completely obvious from what I've said already. So for me, when I say a more participatory economics, what I'm personally thinking about is a method like systems mapping. And systems mapping, I've mentioned that phrase once or twice just before. What I mean by that is basically drawing causal descriptions of a system with people. So I find myself in workshops like this all the time, drawing maps like this, of how we think a policy or a system or a sector is working. And so I've shown you some examples. I've shown you those feedback loops, and those are system maps. They're simple system maps, but they're system maps. Those are what I would call a causal loop diagram, where we have relatively simple feedbacks being generated to give us some narrative in a system. You can have other types of systems maps. You can have bigger, messier, more spaghetti diagram ones. You can have ones that are more about policies and the effects policies have. But I think these tools are a really helpful way of bringing people and stakeholders into a policy discussion alongside the modeling. They become a bridging point between what people think about the system and what modeling is tell us. They can help us build consensus and kind of do modeling in a more inclusive, participatory way. So that's where I see this role of systems mapping. Let me bring things to a close. So yeah, I'm optimistic because I think we do have these new tools emerging and these new methods emerging, and not just emerging like they're just popping out, like they've been around for a few years and we're starting to see them being used. There's governments around the world starting to use them. There's businesses starting to use them. So I'm very optimistic because of that. I'm also optimistic because I think in the past you've seen policy, particularly in government, be much more ambitious than maybe some of the economic advice has been. So when cost benefit analysis has been a bit negative about an idea or a policy, politicians have still ploughed on with it because they could see this bigger picture than the narrow cost benefit analysis. I think some of the investments in renewables in the early 2000s are classic examples of that. Maybe things like the Inflation Reduction Act in the US is a good example of that, of where policymakers were going beyond the economic advice. Okay, I just wanted to flag before I stop a couple of bits of further reading if people are interested. There's some very short pieces where I've written about economic modeling in the energy transition that outlines a lot of the ideas I've spoken about today. There's also a piece myself and colleagues led by Max Collett wrote on these virtuous and vicious cycles in energy transition. These are these different feedback loops. There's a very detail-oriented article on risk opportunity analysis from Jean-François Mercure, and then Rupert Way's paper on these cost curves and forecasts of the energy transition is some of those plots I showed you in that paper. And if you're interested in something a bit more engaging from a kind of in a sort of public focused book, two excellent books I'd recommend from colleagues of mine. One from Simon Sharp, which thinks about how we can go 5 times faster on the climate crisis, and one from Doan Farmer on making sense of chaos, which is all about using these kind of more organic, complexity-based ideas about the economy. So yeah, do check those out if these ideas have been of interesting. So I will stop there and we can move to the Q&A.
Thanks a lot, Pete. That was really a fascinating talk. Absolutely great talk. It thanks us really for drawing through the history also economics over time. So I really would like to kick off a little bit the Q&A. We do already one question from the audience, which is really about how actually might you consider the relative likelihood of scenarios in risk opportunity analysis?
Yeah, I think for me the point is we're not trying to find what is exactly the most likely way forward and say that with some precision and sort of make some kind of precise prediction about this is exactly what's going to happen. What we're trying to do is get a sense of what that potential space is, and if the modeling work is telling us this section of the distribution is more there, maybe like more or less, but it's not. I'm not so interested in like the exact likelihood. It's more roughly where are we at? Is this a normally distributed set of outcomes, or are there long tails where there might be bigger chances of these kind of good or bad, kind of worst case, best case scenarios? And I also think it's even if they're very small likelihood, I think it's really important to think of those kind of worst case, best case. So it's not that they're likely, it's just that the impact of them will be very large. So a policy that has potentially some very big positive payoffs, even though they might be unlikely, maybe that increases the value of it in our eyes when we're doing this type of policy compared to what a cost benefit analysis would say, where it kind of ignore that very edge case, maybe.
We have another question from the audience. In this case, we are back to your renewables work. And one of the participants is asking whether did you look at long duration storage, for instance, in hydrogen, as a way to stop the dumping feedback?
Yes. So absolutely. There's that what we've done in that work and the paper and the report behind it is try and identify these feedback loops there and then propose or discuss some ideas about how they connect. So I think that's a really nice example of one way to think about breaking them. You can also think there's also some of the examples we come up of archetypes are where you have two technologies that the deployment of one allows the deployment of others. And I think there's definitely one there between renewable technologies and storage technologies. One of the system archetypes is around that. So again, we try and describe that qualitatively, how one drives the other and how they can reinforce each other. What we don't do is go into real detail to look at the evidence that that one particular technology is the right one or model that quantitatively. So I think that's part of what's the next step is to then dig further into that.
Thanks a lot. Let me take the chance to get one final question from the audience. And I guess you touch up a little bit your talk today. It's about the critique of economics, traditional economic theory and practice. And in particular, there is a reference to the work of some other scholars like Don Farmer that has been quite dismissive of traditional economics theory. So I guess what we would like to hear is how do you feel that we need to discard much of the methodologies that economics has historically studied and taught in favor of these new approaches? This is the last question, so if you can be brief.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, I really try and step away from the kind of arguments about who's right here. I think we just need more tools and we need to be better at picking the right tool for the job and do less gatekeeping and less kind of arguing over who's right or wrong. All of these models and methods are wrong in one way or another. It's when are we less wrong? When is the advice we get more useful? I think we need to be much more constructive in that debate.
Thanks a lot, Pete. I might close the Q&A for the moment, but I guess I would invite the audience to continue the Q&A offline. I guess really before we close, if you'd like to explore more of what's happening during UCL Bicentenary year, there are several ways you can get involved. You can book a place on the UCL 200 walking tour and discover our full program through UCL 200 events calendar or visit the UCL 200 exhibitions, which is running through the year. We also have 3 new UCL 200 publications, so all of these are linked on the UCL 200 web pages. So just basically scan the QR code on the screen and you can find out more. I would say that really while basically we're closing really this event today, I really would like to remind everyone that our next lunch hour lecture is Moving Markets, Mobility, Memory and Urban Transformation in London and Hong Kong, and it will take place on the 28th of April, always 1 to 2 p.m. I would like to thank you again once more time, Pete, for his talk today was really brilliant, the audience, and with that, I would like really to close the event. Many thanks everyone for spending this hour with us, and many thanks, Pete, for entertaining us with the talk.